Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Hal Fulton and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. Tesla's time. Folks say Mr. Edison didn't like Mr. Tesla. That's true enough, I suppose, in its own way. But folks are always talking about things they don't have any first-hand knowledge of. Me, I was there. I knew both gentlemen. Not like we was chummy or anything. I was only a kid. I cleaned up and ran errands as people around the labs needed. I had dropped out of school when my father died, and my uncle was able to get me that job. Truth to tell, the two gentlemen got on good to start with. I recall as how at that time, that would have been in the middle 80s, the Oregon was in harbor, with two bad dynamos. That was a fast ship in those days, one of the fastest, but it was out of commission on account of electrical problems. And Mr. Tesla, he took his equipment over to the ship to work on the dynamos, fixed them both up, worked until 5 a.m, and on the way back he met Edison and Batchelor and some others. And Edison figures this foreign fellow has had a night out on the town. But Mr. Tesla explained himself, and the old man, he respected hard work and diligence, so Mr. Tesla earned his respect. Nothing unusual about those hours, as it turned out. Tesla was a hard worker, 18 hours a day, hardest worker of all, except for the old man himself. I always called Mr. Edison the old man, though not aloud. I reckon now he was not as old as I thought he was, probably somewhat older than I am right now. As for Mr. Tesla, he was much closer to my own age, and he was friendly-like. He spoke to me on several occasions during those months. He called me William, never called me Will, and of course, he had that accent, being foreign. He told me how important it was to work hard and be dependable, and confided in me that he had done many jobs worse than mine, and worked harder and longer hours. I don't suppose it made much impression on me at the time. And he told me that when I was able, I should continue my education. That was important. And I suppose if he saw me now, he might be disappointed, for I never received much education beyond what I already had, though I did learn to work hard, as we all did back then. Sure enough, they had some disagreements now and again. Mr. Edison was stubborn as a mule, and nobody could make him change his mind, but he would always listen to anybody and give him a chance. Me, I never understood half the stuff I overheard. I just watched and listened and went about my business. But the funny thing was that this Mr. Edison's attitude towards Mr. Tesla changed overnight, or I should say his treatment of him. His attitude changed, if you'll excuse the expression, like flipping a switch. And I am certain to this day that it was no fault of Mr. Tesla's, just as I am certain that Mr. Edison was not acting entirely according to his conscience. It was a strange thing, truly, for though I saw the old man treat the other unfairly and heard him speak unkindly, yet I couldn't help feeling that he was some kind of double-minded about it, like he was doing it for some reason against his will. And it all went back to one single evening. It was late, and most people had gone home. Ordinarily, I would have long been home myself by that hour, but the old man himself had sent me out to get some items for his personal use. What things they were, I can't recall anymore. So, there I was on the top floor of that main building. It was a modern building for its time. Goes without saying, it was electric, but many of the lights were off, so it was dim-like. Tall ceilings, wide hallway, and I don't mind telling you I was a little bit spooked, as I was not used to being there so late, with it dark and deserted. So, when I saw this funny blue light at the end of the hall, it startled me, and I just stopped right there, standing there with that box. There were other folks on the premises for sure, but scattered here and there. On that particular floor, I would not be surprised if there was no one but me and the old man at that hour. The unusual silence in the blue light, as I say, spooked me a little. I grant you, I saw many things in my time there. The electrical machinery was fascinating to me, as it would have been to anyone my age, and half the time I understood it no better than if it had been sheer magic. I recall a thing ball-like on top, with a crank, and it made a man's hair stand on end. And many of the workers regarded their work as play of a kind, though I reckon they did their jobs all the same. They would leave these little things lying around charged up, and you would pick it up, and it would shock you, just bite a little. It was a kind of foolery that would have earned me a paddling at school, but these grown men practiced it freely. Yet I also learned respect for electricity. I was once there in person when a man reached out to touch something, and the spark jumped nearly a foot out to his hand. It shocked him badly, laid him out cold right there on the floor, and for a moment we feared for his life. But presently he came around, and though the doctor sent him home for the day, he ended up being all right. But I tell you the truth, I learned a valuable lesson there, not to fool with things I don't understand. I learned that lesson more than once in that place, and that knowledge served me well. As I said, the labs were usually noisy. There was a constant sound of construction, along with the sparks and discharges and whatnot that made up the daily life of that place. So, the quiet that night was unearthly, giving one that feeling of walking in a graveyard. But I have left my story. Anyhow, I neared the end of the hall where the old man had his own large room with a little office area at the front of it. The door was ajar, which was nothing unusual, and the light inside was dim, also nothing unusual. He kept the strangest hours of any man I ever knew, and he even kept a cot right there handy so that he could sleep at any time. And he would often take naps of an hour or less and jump up and right back to work. My first clue that something was out of the ordinary was, as I said, a blue light that I saw emanate from behind the door, and the sight of it stopped me dead in my tracks. It started out dim, barely visible against whatever electric light burned in the room, and it grew more intense in a few seconds before it went out entirely. And I venture to guess that Mr. Edison was in fact sleeping, because I heard an exclamation from him, sounding like someone startled awake, and a little loud on account of his deafness. And right then, as I say, I nearly dropped that box of goods and rushed in to see what the matter was. But something made me hold back, and I was always glad I did. Instead, I eased the box to the floor, quiet-like, and crept forward slowly. The floors were hardwood, well-constructed, and likely would not have creaked, and he would have not heard anyway, but my instincts were to be cautious. Presently, I was surprised to hear voices coming from the room. I say surprised because I had every reason to expect the old man was by himself in there. One voice was certainly Mr. Edison's, and there was a small degree of alarm or agitation in it, which went away shortly. It was still too far away to make out any words, though I knew I did not recognize the stranger's voice. But I kept creeping forward, painfully slow, and eventually I could overhear some of that conversation. And an odd conversation it was. I feared getting too close, so I could not make out the whole thing. There was some talk of a book, and of a calamity of some kind, a danger. From my vantage point against the wall, I craned my neck a little and could make out a little of the scene. They were not in the front area, or I could have heard better, but more towards the back of the room. Mr. Edison was seated by the side of a long workbench, thumbing through a book, and the stranger stood before him. And I swear to you, I have never seen anyone dressed in such a way, before or since. My first impression was some kind of one-piece garment, like overalls or something, but it was of a fabric or material I was not familiar with, some material that wrinkled like cloth but was shiny as steel. The sight was so strange that I confess it occurred to me to wonder whether Mr. Edison was being visited by an angel. Like most folks, I don't put too much stock in that stuff, but I was reminded of Sunday school and the young man in shiny white at the tomb. But the fellow looked earthly enough, even if he looked out of place, and the tone of his voice did not seem anything too odd to me. He kept pointing out things in the book as Mr. Edison turned the pages, and he had some other things to show him also. One thing was like a framed picture, but I swear to you that the picture moved like a magic lantern, but with nowhere to project from. I saw it clearly, as it was angled toward me once, and I heard sounds come from it as plain as day, voices and music, and sounds like crowds of people at a distance. And Edison grew so excited that he got up and began to pace, and I was forced to duck back into the darkness for fear he should see me. And I heard him ask how all this was possible. And the stranger was talking about a river. He said that time was like a river, though I cannot say what he meant by that. And he said more that I could not catch. There was some urgency to his tone, as if he was trying to persuade Mr. Edison of something. And he spoke more of a calamity or disaster, but I could never catch any of the specifics. And he said, finally, that he had only a short time to stay here, only a few minutes, and he said he would leave the book, but that it should not fall into anyone else's hands. And he said he had to leave immediately. This caused me some concern, as there was only one way out of the room and the building, and he would have to pass right by me. I readied myself to duck into a doorway if need be, as most of the doors in the hallway were not locked, and some stood ajar. But I sneaked a peek anyway, and saw that the stranger was not moving toward the door at all. But he went and stood in a bare spot on the floor, and Mr. Edison moved toward him, but the stranger said, "Do not touch me," and the old man stepped back again. And then, why should you believe me? The stranger began to glow with that same blue light, and only a second passed before there was a brilliant flash that took a few seconds to die away. I saw spots before my eyes. If you have ever been photographed and looked straight at the powder when it flared, you know what I mean. In that awful silence that followed, my heart was hammering. It was only seconds before I started to doubt the evidence of my senses, and I wanted to pinch myself to see if it had all been a dream. And sneaking another peek, I saw the old man clutching the book in both his hands and staring at it like he had never seen a book before in all his days. And I figured he felt the same, and that he couldn't believe his eyes, and he was holding tight the one thing he had that showed it was all real. I kept watching, though I hated eavesdropping and spying, and I saw him walk up toward the door, to the office area, and he took the book and put it in a drawer in his desk. I did not want him to suspect that I had been around, so I counted 100, slow-like, and then did it again and let some time pass. Then I took a deep breath and grabbed the box by the handles and walked in, as if I had just arrived. He took the stuff and said, "Thank you, Will." But you could see his mind was elsewhere. He gave me a dime and sent me off, and I never spoke to him of what I saw. It was 2 nights before I could find a chance to do what I had to do. It was hard to find a time when the old man was not there, as he would often work through the night and into the morning, and you could never tell when he was coming or going. But I had found out by listening that he was for sure going to be away that night, and I arranged to be there. My supervisor trusted me with a set of keys, but I had no good excuse for being around at that hour, so I was feeling a little scared and very cautious. No sooner had I set foot on the stairs that I encountered Mr. Tesla himself coming down, and my heart leaped in my chest. "Good evening, William," he said in his clipped, precise way of talking, and I stammered an answer. "You are not getting into trouble, are you?" he asked. For a second, I was awfully afraid, but then I realized he was just joking with me. "No, sir," I said, and I grinned as well as I could, and we passed on the stairs, and that was that. No one else was around, and I got to the 3rd floor without seeing anyone. At the end of the hall, the old man's door was locked, which did not surprise me, but my key opened it. I risked the electric light, as folks were used to seeing it at all hours anyhow. The drawers were not locked, as no one would dare mess with the old man's things, and I was amazed that I was straying it myself. The middle drawer on the right held the mysterious book. As soon as I laid eyes on it, it was unusual to me. I did not even have to open it. The cover was unusually flattened, the binding very plain. I would have thought that it was simply a cheap item, except that the workmanship seemed so fine. On reflection, it seemed plain in the same way that the engineers preferred their surroundings and furnishings, Spartan and no nonsense. The title was in shiny letters, plain and blocky, and would you believe I cannot remember what the title was? That's how tricky memory is. But it said something about the Tesla Institute. Of that I'm sure. I did not finish my schooling, as I say, but I could read all right. The name jumped right out at me, of course, and I wondered if it had to do with some relative of our Mr. Tesla. And when I opened it, the pages themselves were brilliant white, and so smooth that they were shiny, and the print was fine and crisp and black. There was no frontispiece to the book or anything of that sort. I guess there was a table of contents, but I don't recall. I flipped through it slowly with a keen curiosity and a growing sense of wonder. The pictures! That is what I remember best. I do not mean engravings or drawings such as we are so used to, but actual photographs. Now, we have all seen photographs reproduced in books. That's no big deal. But these were different. They were crisp and clear, and they were like frozen moments in time. I saw things that were clearly in motion, and yet they were photographed and made to look as though they were standing still. And they were in color, and I would bet you that no human hand had colored them. They just looked too natural, too lifelike. But the things in the pictures, that was what puzzled and disturbed me the most. For many of those things, I was certain had never existed anywhere. Not in my part of the world, or any other. And yet there I was, looking at them. And as I said, they were not drawings. You could tell they were photographs. I saw motor cars racing down wide streets between huge buildings. Back then, even in the cities, we hardly even knew what automobiles were. The Germans and some others had fooled with such, and the folks I was around every day were excited by the idea, and they were mightily interested for the most part. The motor cars simply were not common at all, and I had only seen a few. But these wheeled contraptions in the pictures were the same kind of thing, if you get my drift, even if they were fully enclosed and oddly shaped and brightly colored. Some of the pictures showed tall steel towers that seemed to reach for heaven. Some of them had shafts of light stabbing across the air between them. Even more incredibly, I saw pictures of flying machines. I am not making this up. Airships of many different kinds. Others were balloon-like, like giant whales swimming in the air. And finally, I swear to you, I saw pictures of flying machines that were neither winged nor balloon-like, but hung, suspended in the air, by God knows what art, and they glowed at the bottom. And some of these things were no larger than the automobiles were, and they flew between buildings in large numbers. I could scarcely tear my eyes from the pictures, but the words drew my curiosity, for I wanted to have some explanation of what I saw. But I did not have much luck there. It was in English, all right, and I understood the English for the most part, but the sentences were short and choppy, and I couldn't make sense of much of it. There were words that I had never seen before. That was not unusual, except that there were so many of them. And there were numbers here and there that confused me, until I realized that they were meant to signify years. You'll think me a fool, but at the time it hadn't dawned on me that a year could even start with 19, as then we were still more than a decade from the turn of the century. So this started to read like a history book, but with all the years the wrong way. It strained my imagination, but I reckoned it was like taking a history test of the last 100 years and somehow delivering it to George Washington. Here, sir, here's a record of the 18th century for you. That was what I was holding in my hands, a history book of things that hadn't happened yet. When I came to this understanding, I started looking for the dates. One year that sticks in my mind is 1973. It says something about gravity cancellation becoming practical in 1973. I do not know what that means, but it had to do with the flying machines. What disturbed me most was something about world wars, 3 of them if I understood rightly. I do not know much about war, but I know it to be a terrible thing. So I sat and read until my eyes were bleary, and I put the book back in its place. I left the building, and no one ever knew I was there. It was then that Mr. Edison began behaving oddly. I recall meetings with the senior staff, meetings I naturally was not there for, but I overheard bits and pieces as always. There was much arguing and discussion, and as always, he was stubborn as a mule, and always got his way. People started giving Mr. Tesla a cold shoulder, giving him a wide berth. I do not know whether he even noticed. He was always wrapped up in the machines. Once, in one of the larger areas, I saw Mr. Edison standing on a catwalk and looking down at where Mr. Tesla was working. And his eyes, as he looked down at him, were funny. They were without malice and even held pity. I realized then where I'd seen that look before. Out on my uncle's place in the country, as a child, I saw that same look on a farmer's face as he dealt a mercy killing to an injured animal. As far as I know, no one else ever saw the book. I should mention that I did see it once more. I was on the basement level one day, and I encountered Mr. Edison there, where I never knew him to go before or since. He did not speak to me, which was also unusual. The old man had the book in his hands, and I saw him personally feed it into the incinerator. Nothing was ever the same between Tesla and the old man, or between him and anyone, really. In the end, I'm sorry to say they cheated him out of a large sum of money that they had promised him upon the completion of some work. He left the company then, of his own will, so far as I know, and I have never seen him again. Some folks say that Mr. Edison set out to destroy or, discredit Mr. Tesla. Well, it did not seem so, for that sort of thing continued even after the other man had left. I do not know what it was all about, but it had less to do with the alternating current, and more to do with the visit from the stranger. That is what I say. And I declaimed that Mr. Tesla never deserved such treatment, nor was it wholly in character for Mr. Edison to behave so. And over the years I have given much thought to the whole matter, though nearly 30 years have passed, and my memory of those few minutes in the dark is so dim now. I would think that I had dreamed the whole thing, but I don't have that much imagination. I stood on the riverbank once, and I believe I know what the stranger meant by saying time was like a river. It flows on its own, and if you go with the flow, you go where it takes you. But you can move under your own power if you want. You can go forward or backward, or with or against the current. As I said, I never got much education and never read much, but I have heard of Mr. Herbert George Wells, and I can see where time might be like a river. But there is something else about rivers. They change courses. And I think that was the whole point of the visit. To fix something that went wrong somehow. I don't know what kind of disaster or calamity the visitor was talking about, but it must be something worse than 3 world wars. Anyhow, I reckon the river has changed course already. Did I tell you I tore a page from the book? It was the only thing I ever stole from the old man, or any other employer. That page mentioned in passing the First World War and how many died terribly in it. But that war began in 1910, so said the book. It is now 1911, and we have had no war. So I suppose the river has changed course, and we have escaped that tragedy, and the world is a better place. That's a good thing, then, isn't it? Thank you for listening. We love our listeners, fans, and patrons here at Untold Tales, and we would love to hear from you. Please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, letting us know what your favorite story has been in our 3 seasons of storytelling so far. We'd love to continue shaping our podcast with stories that you'd like to hear. As always, thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.